The official document arrived on a Tuesday. That detail mattered to Admiral Sarah Voss, because Tuesdays had always been unremarkable. Tuesdays were budget reviews and cafeteria fish specials and the kind of paperwork that made you question your career choices. She was on her third cup of coffee when Lieutenant Adeyemi placed the translated transcript on her desk with the carefully blank expression of someone who had already read it and decided he wanted no part of whatever happened next. The document was a formal declaration from the Hegemony Conclave, the 7-species governing body that administered roughly 40% of the explored galaxy. Humanity had known about the Conclave for 11 years, ever since the Pioneer's probe array had picked up the hyperspatial relay beacon near Proxima. Contact had been slow, careful, mediated by translation software that was still more art than science. Diplomatic channels had opened. Cautious exchanges of cultural data had followed. Earth had, in the measured opinion of most xenolinguists, been doing rather well. The document said otherwise. It did not say it rudely. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. The language was precise, almost clinical, the way a doctor sounds when delivering a prognosis. The conclave acknowledged humanity's notable adaptive traits and our unexpectedly sophisticated social infrastructure. It then outlined, in 14 numbered subsections, why none of that would be enough. Humanity had been given access to the Galactic Commons too soon. That was the conclave's position. The fault, it generously acknowledged, lay not with us but with the contact protocols. We should have been observed for another century before introduction. We were, in the conclave's assessment, a late-emergent civilization, roughly equivalent to what they called a Class 4 society, marked by tribal conflict structures only partially sublimated into cooperative institutions, by resource anxiety not yet resolved into abundance economies, and by a pattern of self-destructive technological escalation that had, in their historical records, ended badly for 11 of the last 14 Class 4 civilizations encountered. Therefore the conclave had voted. The vote was 5-2. Two species, the Shin and the Vorath, had abstained with objections registered. 5 had voted to implement what the document called provisional disengagement. Trade would halt. The hyperspatial relay codes that allowed faster-than-light communication would be revoked. The diplomatic mission on Conclave Station would be permitted to remain for 90 standard days before the station's access corridor was sealed. Then Earth would be left alone. The document did not say how long provisional disengagement would last. It included a single sentence on that subject. Re-engagement will be considered upon evidence of civilizational stabilization, which historical precedent suggests requires between 40 and 300 standard years. Standard years converted to Earth years at a ratio of approximately 0.97. The math was not complicated. Sarah read the document twice. Then she set it down, looked out her office window at the gray March sky over Brussels, and thought about her daughter, who was 7 years old and had just learned to ride a bicycle without training wheels and had announced at dinner last week that she wanted to be an astronaut. "Get me a line to the Secretary General," she said. "And get me the heads of the ISEA Xenoeconomics Division. All of them." "Yes, Admiral. The Secretary General is already asking for you." "Of course she is." Sarah picked up the document again. She turned to the appendix, which she had not yet read. The appendix contained the supporting data the conclave had submitted to justify the vote. Population models. Resource depletion curves. Conflict escalation statistics. A graph showing the probability of human civilizational collapse over time, with 3 different models represented in 3 different colors. The most optimistic model gave humanity a 34% chance of surviving the next 50 years as a functioning technological civilization without external guidance. The most pessimistic gave us 11%. All 3 models agreed that the most dangerous window was the first 20 to 40 years after disengagement, when the loss of conclave trade goods and technology would stress existing economic systems while the shock of isolation processed through human political structures in unpredictable ways. "Weeks," said Lieutenant Adeyemi quietly. He was still standing by her desk. Sarah looked up. "Sorry, Admiral. I've been reading the secondary analysis documents that came with the transmission. The senior analyst at Conclave Station, Dr. Marembi, she sent a personal note alongside the official packet." He paused. "She says there's an informal betting pool on Conclave Station. Among the diplomatic staff of the various species." "On what?" "On how long before Earth's political structures fragment past the point of central coordination. The median estimate is 9 weeks. Some of the Vorath attaches are betting as few as 3. Sarah put the document down very carefully. "What is Dr. Marembi betting?" "She isn't. She said she didn't think it was funny." "No," said Sarah. It isn't. She stood up and reached for her jacket. Give me that line. And Adeyemi, not a word of this to anyone outside the loop until the Secretary General decides on public communication timing. Not a word. Understood, Admiral. She paused at the door. Through the window, one of Brussels' ubiquitous pigeons was investigating a windowsill with the focused optimism of a creature that had never once in its life read a probability chart. 9 weeks, she said to no one in particular. She had the feeling that someone, somewhere, was going to be very surprised. The Secretary General of the United Earth Assembly, a woman named Chidinma Okafor who had spent 30 years in environmental policy before anyone had asked her to run the planet, made the announcement 11 days after the conclave document arrived. She did not soften it. There had been debate about that, fierce debate, in the 3 days between when the senior leadership was briefed and when the public learned the truth. Several advisors argued for a managed release, for framing, for what one communications director called contextual scaffolding. Okafor had listened to all of it with the expression of someone waiting for a bus that was already 20 minutes late. We tell them the truth, she said. We tell them the whole truth. And then we tell them what we're going to do about it. The announcement went out on every channel simultaneously. It was watched live by approximately 4 billion people. The other 3 billion caught it within the next 6 hours. Okafor spoke for 37 minutes. She explained what provisional disengagement meant in practical terms. The loss of the conclave's pharmaceutical synthesis protocols, which had been supplementing cancer treatment programs in 43 countries. The end of the hyperspatial communication network. The closure of the 3 joint research stations near Jupiter that had been humanity's most ambitious scientific collaboration. She explained that certain rare earth extraction techniques transferred by Shin engineers would still function but that the conclave's proprietary energy storage compounds, which powered about 11% of global grid infrastructure, would need to be replaced within 3 years before stockpiles depleted. She explained the conclave's reasoning. She read the probability statistics out loud. Then she said something that would be quoted for the next 2 decades. The conclave is not wrong about what we are. They are wrong about what we can become. And the difference between those 2 things is the entire history of our species. The response was not uniformly noble. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. There were riots in 6 cities in the first week, mostly driven by panic about pharmaceutical supplies. 4 governments collapsed over the following 3 months, unable to hold their coalitions together under the stress. The internet produced conspiracy theories, as the internet reliably did, several of which were creative enough to suggest that the whole thing was a fabrication designed to justify some other government's policy agenda. But something else happened too. Something that the conclave's models had not adequately weighted. Humans started solving problems. The pharmaceutical crisis was the most urgent. The conclave synthesis protocols had been used for modified cancer therapeutics that worked better than anything developed purely by human science, and removing them meant a gap in treatment capability that would cost lives. Dr. Una Park, who ran the WHO's Advanced Oncology Division in Geneva, had been working with the conclave protocols for 4 years. The day after Okafor's announcement, she called a meeting of every oncology research division that would pick up the phone. Within a week, she had assembled a working group of over 2,000 scientists across 19 countries. Within 3 months, they had reverse-engineered the biological mechanism the conclave protocols exploited and were developing a purely human-derived alternative. It took another 8 months to reach clinical viability. It was not as elegant as the conclave version. It worked. That pattern repeated itself across sectors. Not perfectly, not without losses, not without years of grinding work and setbacks and moments where the probability charts seemed entirely plausible. The energy gap took 4 years to close and required the fastest large-scale infrastructure build-out since the post-war reconstruction programs of the 1940s. The research stations near Jupiter were sealed rather than abandoned, their data preserved, with the understanding that someone would come back eventually. The political fragmentation the conclave had predicted happened too in its way. The assembly had its worst 5 years in its history, marked by walkouts and budget crises and 2 genuine constitutional challenges. But the assembly did not dissolve. The framework held. Partly because of genuine political skill from people like Okafor and her counterparts. Partly because of a phenomenon that the sociologists were still arguing about. A baseline human stubbornness, activated by the specific indignity of being told you were probably going to fail. At Conclave Station, the human diplomatic team of 90 days stretched to 91, then 92. The station's administrator, a Vorith named Coordinator Eshlek, who had voted against disengagement, quietly stopped enforcing the deadline. Nobody at Conclave asked him to explain why. But on day 180, when a junior conclave analyst updated the betting pool, the median collapse estimate had shifted from 9 weeks to 8 months. Then a year. Nobody was quite willing to say what that meant. On Earth, in a laboratory in Nairobi, Dr. Park's team ran the 47th iteration of their modified therapeutic protocol through a trial cohort. The results came back at 9 p.m. local time. She looked at them for a long time before she called her division head. "It works," she said. "It works better than the last run." Her division head said something unrepeatable in 3 languages. "Yeah," said Dr. Park. "I know." The Vorath had a word for it. Voss found it in a xenolinguistics briefing on year 3, when she had been promoted to lead IZEA's Office of Conclave Relations, which was a grand title for an office whose primary job was monitoring an organization that had officially stopped talking to them. The word was erethkai. It translated, imprecisely, as the unsettling competence of something you expected to die. Coordinator Eschlek used it in a private communique to his government in year 3, in a document that was not meant to be intercepted. IZEA's Signals Intelligence Division had been improving its capacity for decrypting conclave relay transmissions, one of the projects funded in the emergency infrastructure buildup. The communique was flagged, translated, and placed on Sarah Voss's desk with a note that said, "You're going to want to read this." Eschlek's communique was a status report, clinical and precise in the way Vorath communication tended to be. He described Earth's pharmaceutical adaptation. He described the energy infrastructure transition. He noted the political instability with appropriate weight but also noted that the Assembly had not only survived its constitutional crises but emerged from them with a revised charter that several of his contacts in Vorath political theory found structurally interesting. He described the Jupiter Station Preservation Project and the continued expansion of human deep space observation capacity. Then he wrote a paragraph that ISA translated 3 times to make sure they had it right. The Class 4 trajectory models assume a civilization under civilizational stress will reduce complexity, fragment cooperation structures, and retreat to tribal resource competition. This assumption holds for 11 of 14 historical cases in our records. In the Earth case, civilizational stress appears to be producing the opposite effect. Cooperation frameworks are expanding, not contracting. Scientific collaboration networks have grown 34% since disengagement. Domestic political conflict, while significant, is primarily channeled through institutional structures rather than around them. The civilization is not simplifying under pressure. It is increasing in complexity. I do not have a model for this. He had attached an addendum at the end. Personal, not official. It said, "I think we should be paying closer attention." It took 8 months for the conclave to respond to his report, which in conclave time was actually fairly fast. The response was a request for more data. More monitoring. The establishment of a formal observation protocol for the Earth system. They were, in other words, watching. Sarah found this alternately flattering and infuriating, an emotional combination she had gotten used to. The infuriating part was obvious. The flattering part was the specific shape of the conclave's attention. They had stopped treating the Earth file as a death watch and started treating it as a case study. Somewhere in the conclave bureaucracy, someone had created a new category. In year 4 the first real contact came. Not official, not through recognized channels. It came through a Shin scientist named researcher Thesavac, who had been one of the engineers involved in the original technology transfers and who had, according to IZEA's file on her, voted against disengagement and internal Shin deliberations. She sent a message through a private relay, technically in violation of conclave protocols, addressed to Dr. Park. The message said, "I have read your published therapeutic adaptation papers. Your mechanism is different from ours but achieves analogous results through a pathway we had not considered. I am attaching 3 of my own papers that may be relevant to your next phase. I am sending these as a private individual. I expect no response is necessary." Dr. Park responded within 4 hours. The correspondence continued for 2 years before anyone in an official capacity acknowledged it was happening. By that point, 6 other informal scientific exchanges had begun through similar channels. None of them were authorized. None of them were stopped. In year 5 the first formal backchannel opened. Not a restoration of official diplomatic relations, just a quiet agreement between Coordinator Eschlek and IZEA's senior attaché at Conclave Station, still technically present despite the long-expired deadline, to share certain categories of data. Climate monitoring. Stellar cartography. Nothing politically sensitive. Sarah signed off on the agreement at 11 p.m. on a Thursday, alone in her office with a cup of tea that had gone cold. She thought about the betting pool on Conclave Station. 9 weeks to collapse. 5 years had passed. She thought about HFY's word. Erethkai. The unsettling competence of something you expected to die. She was starting to find that word funny. She was also starting to find it motivating in a way she didn't entirely want to examine, because it implied that humanity was performing not for itself but for an audience, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that. But then she thought about Dr. Park's therapeutic protocol, which had now treated over 200,000 patients, and she decided that whether or not the conclave was watching was somewhat beside the point. The work was the work. The survival was the survival. She drank her cold tea. She had paperwork to do in the morning. The review came at year 10, which was when conclave internal protocols required a formal reassessment of any provisional disengagement still in effect. Sarah Voss attended it as an observer, technically. She had been permitted to submit a written brief on Earth's behalf, which was 700 pages long and took her team 8 months to prepare. She sat in the observation gallery of the conclave's secondary chamber on Conclave Station, which smelled of the specific combination of atmospheric compositions required to keep 7 species comfortable simultaneously, a smell she had gotten used to over years of intermittent presence here. The chamber was large, built to impress, which it did despite her best efforts to be professionally unimpressed. The conclave counselors sat at a curved dais of 9 seats, though only 7 were occupied. The 2 empty seats had been there as long as anyone could remember, reserved for species the conclave expected to eventually encounter. Sarah had spent some time thinking about those empty seats. The review proceedings lasted 3 days. She was permitted to present a condensed oral summary of Earth's progress on the second day, standing at a podium that had been calibrated to human ergonomic dimensions with a thoughtfulness that she suspected was HFY's doing. She spoke for 2 hours. She covered the pharmaceutical and energy adaptations. She covered the expansion of the Assembly's institutional framework. She presented the deep space observation data, which was now sophisticated enough to provide genuinely useful stellar cartographic contributions, information she knew the conclave wanted. She covered the climate stabilization initiatives, which were ahead of their pre-disengagement projections. She covered the cooperative research networks, a figure she presented with particular care. 847 active international scientific collaborations, roughly double the pre-disengagement number. She covered the losses too. She did not minimize them. There had been years of excess mortality attributable to the pharmaceutical gap during the transition period. 14,000 deaths was the careful epidemiological estimate, lower than the worst projections but real and specific and not to be smoothed over. There had been economic dislocations, regional conflicts that analysts believed had been exacerbated by the stress of disengagement, a spike in mental health crises in the years immediately following the announcement. She listed them. Then she said, "We are not here to argue that the conclave made its decision lightly or without genuine concern for historical precedent. We are here to present evidence that the precedent does not fully describe us." She paused. She had thought carefully about this next part. 11 of 14 Class 4 civilizations in your records collapsed under conditions similar to what we have experienced. We acknowledge that data. We also note that 3 did not collapse. We note that your records on those 3 are substantially thinner than your records on the 11, because you stopped watching them closely once the crisis passed and engagement resumed. We would like to suggest that the 3 survivors may have had something in common that your models have not yet captured. We believe we may be showing you what that something is. There was a silence in the chamber that she had learned, over years of exposure to conclave proceedings, was the specific silence of people who were genuinely thinking rather than waiting for a turn to speak. It was a different quality from the polite silences and the impatient silences. She had come to recognize it as the best thing you could hope for from an audience. The council did not vote to end provisional disengagement at the Year 10 review. She had not expected them to. The motion failed 4-3 with the Shin and Vorath representatives voting in favor of restoration alongside a third counselor, a Drevithi named Archivist Semelin, who had been largely silent throughout the proceedings but who voted yes without explanation and met Sarah's eyes briefly as she left the chamber. But the council voted 7-0 on a secondary motion that had not been on the official agenda. Coordinator HFY had introduced it on the morning of the 3rd day, with a procedural efficiency that suggested it had been prepared well in advance. The motion called for the establishment of a formal observation commission for the Earth system, with regular reporting requirements and a defined reassessment schedule. In conclave terms, this was significant. Observation commissions existed for active member civilizations and for civilizations formally under consideration for membership. They did not exist for civilizations under provisional disengagement. Eshlek caught Sarah in the corridor outside the chamber afterward. He was tall even for a Vorith, built in a way that reminded her of a birch tree, pale, vertical, with the suggestion that bending was technically possible but not preferred. His secondary eyes, the small amber ones set above his primary pair, were doing the thing she had learned to recognize as the Vorith equivalent of a thoughtful frown. "Your speech was well constructed," he said. "Thank you, Coordinator. The Drevithi vote was unexpected. I did not arrange it. I didn't think you had." Archivist Semelin has spent 40 years studying civilizational collapse patterns. She has not voted yes on anything related to an isolated civilization in 23 years. He paused. "I thought you should know that." Sarah considered this. "Does she say why she voted yes?" "She said you described the losses honestly. She said that in her experience, civilizations that describe their own failures honestly to an audience with power over them are rarer than civilizations that survive." Sarah walked back to the human section of Conclave Station. She sat in her office, which was small and slightly too warm and had a view of the docking bay that she had spent 10 years looking at. Year 10. The Conclave's most optimistic model had given them a 34% survival probability. It was year 10 and Earth still had a functioning assembly, a growing scientific apparatus, and now an observation commission. She wrote a message to Secretary General Okafor. It was brief. It said, "Year 10 review complete. No restoration of engagement but forward progress. The vote count changed. Recommend we stay the course." Then she added after a moment, "Tell Dr. Park I said hello." The years between 10 and 18 were not dramatic. That was perhaps the most important thing about them. Drama requires discontinuity, moments of rupture and decision. The years between 10 and 18 were instead characterized by the slow, incremental accumulation of a civilization choosing day after day, in 1,000 unglamorous ways, to keep functioning. There was a historian, Dr. Emmanuel Achebe at the University of Lagos, who spent much of this period working on what would become the definitive early account of the disengagement era. He interviewed over 400 people for the project. Politicians, engineers, scientists, teachers, farmers, factory workers, a retired pigeon racer from Bristol who had been 12 years old when Okafor made the announcement and who said, with disarming simplicity, that he remembered thinking it meant no aliens would ever come, and that made him sad, but then his mum made shepherd's pie for dinner and it seemed less catastrophic by morning. Achebe's thesis, developed through those interviews, was that the conclave had made a fundamental category error. They had modeled humanity as a civilization, a single unit with measurable stability metrics. What they had failed to model adequately was humanity as approximately 8 billion overlapping and semi-independent projects, each of which had its own logic of continuation and its own reasons to persist regardless of what was happening at the macro level. The shepherd's pie was part of the argument. Not facetiously. The ordinary continuation of ordinary things, the meals cooked and children raised and crafts maintained and relationships sustained, was itself a form of civilizational resilience that did not appear in stability indices or cooperation metrics. It was, Achebe argued, the substrate on which everything else rested, and it was nearly impossible to model because it was nearly impossible to stop. The Observation Commission filed 18 reports in those 8 years. Sarah read all of them. She was not supposed to have access to conclave internal documents, but Eshlek's office had developed a habit of leaving certain files in the shared research database for the Jupiter cartography project. Files that happened to include attachments clearly not related to cartography. She had mentioned this once to Eshlek. He had looked at her with his secondary eyes doing the thoughtful frown and said that he could not be responsible for every attachment his administrative staff added to shared databases. She had not mentioned it again. The Commission reports tracked the same metrics the original disengagement decision had been based on, running them against the original probability models. By year 12, Earth's actual trajectory had diverged from all 3 collapse models to a statistically significant degree. The Commission's Year 12 report used the phrase, outside predicted parameters 4 times. The Year 14 report used it 11 times. In Year 15, the Commission produced an internal paper titled Reassessment of Class 4 Civilizational Dynamics. It was authored by archivist Semelin and 2 colleagues. Sarah did not have access to this document through the cartography database, but she heard about it from Dr. Thesavac, whose informal correspondence with Dr. Park had by this point evolved into a joint research partnership that everyone in both their institutions was aware of and no one was officially acknowledging. Thesavac described the paper's central argument, that the 3 surviving Class 4 civilizations in the conclave's historical record all shared a pattern that the original models had not weighted sufficiently. Under conditions of external pressure, they had not merely maintained their existing cooperative structures. They had used the pressure as a catalyst to build new ones. The conclave's models had been designed to detect civilizational stability. They had not been designed to detect civilizational growth. Sarah was in a meeting in Brussels when Thesevac's message arrived. She read it on her phone under the table, which she knew was rude and did not care. She read it twice, excused herself, and went to stand in the corridor outside the meeting room. She thought about what Achebe had said in an interview he had given for a documentary, which she had watched late one night during year 13. We did not survive the disengagement because we were stable. Stability was never quite our thing. We survived it because we could not stop building. It's an annoying quality in a lot of contexts. In that particular context, it saved us. She stood in the corridor for 3 minutes. Then she went back into the meeting. The agenda item was a proposed expansion of the Assembly's Scientific Coordination Charter. Specifically, a framework for pooling deep space observation data from national agencies into a unified planetary astronomy grid. The proposal had been sitting in committee for 8 months, held up by budget disputes and sovereignty concerns. She had been vaguely supportive of it before. She pushed it through herself by the end of the week. Some things you could not know were important until you understood the context. The context had just become clearer. In year 16, the Assembly's planetary astronomy grid came online. Its first major contribution was a refined map of the hyperspatial relay network, calibrated well enough to identify 17 relay points that the conclave's official charts had listed as dormant. 3 of them were not dormant. Sarah's office spent 6 months verifying the data before she sent a politely worded note to Coordinator Eschlek asking if he could confirm or deny certain details of conclave relay infrastructure in the Seoul sector. He confirmed. He also, in the same message, indicated that the upcoming Year 18 review had been moved forward 3 months at the request of Archivist Semelin, who had submitted a procedural motion to the Conclave Council that Sarah was not yet authorized to see but that Eschlek described as consequential. Sarah read that word several times. She called Okafor. "I think something is changing," she said. "Good changing or bad changing?" She thought about 11 of 14 civilizations. She thought about the shepherd's pie. She thought about 847 scientific collaborations and an observation commission that had run out of collapse models that fit the data. "Good," she said. "I think good." The motion that Archivist Semelin submitted to the Conclave Council was 43 pages long and had been signed by 11 other Conclave officials before it was formally tabled. Sarah finally received a copy 6 weeks before the review, through official channels for the first time, with a cover note from the Council Secretariat that was entirely procedural and revealed nothing. She read it in one sitting. Then she called her team and read it to them out loud. The motion argued for the formal termination of provisional disengagement and the initiation of what it called Stage 1 reintegration proceedings, which would place Earth on a recognized path toward full conclave engagement. It was not yet full membership. The motion was careful about that. But it was the mechanism by which full membership became possible, the door before the door. The evidentiary section was meticulous. Semelin had spent years building the case and it showed. She cited the pharmaceutical adaptation, not just as evidence of problem-solving capacity but as an example of what she called adversarial innovation, the ability to produce better solutions under constraint than had been produced under assistance. She cited the Assembly's institutional evolution, the revised charter that had come out of the Year 3 constitutional crisis, which Vorath political theorists had by this point studied in detail and described as representing a structural advancement beyond what the pre-disengagement assembly had achieved. She cited the cooperation network expansion, the deep space observation capabilities, and the relay mapping data, which had genuinely surprised several of the Commission's technical members. She also cited something that Sarah had not expected. She cited the losses. The 14,000 deaths from the pharmaceutical transition period. The regional conflicts. The mental health crisis years. She cited them not as evidence against humanity but as evidence of something she called accountable processing. Her argument was dense but its core was clear. Civilizations that could not face their own failures honestly could not learn from them, and civilizations that could not learn from failures under pressure did not survive long enough for their other qualities to matter. The Year 10 presentation, in which Sarah had laid out the costs without minimization, had apparently been a topic of extended discussion within the Commission. The representatives of Earth described their failures to a body that held significant power over their future, Semelin wrote. They did this clearly and without strategic omission. In 40 years of studying civilizational development, I have found this quality to be both rare and prognostically significant. Sarah read that sentence 4 times. She thought about what she had said at year 10. She had not made a strategic calculation to be honest about the losses. She had been honest because being dishonest about dead people had seemed obscene. It had not occurred to her until this moment that it might have been the most important thing she said. The review convened on the first Thursday of the 18th year. The chamber felt different from the year 10 review, less like a judicial proceeding and more like something she didn't quite have a word for. An accounting maybe. A reckoning that had been building for a long time. Semelin presented the motion. She spoke for 4 hours across 2 sessions, with the precise, unhurried cadence of someone who has been preparing for this moment for 8 years and has no intention of rushing it. When she finished the evidentiary summary, she looked directly at the observation gallery, where Sarah was sitting, and said, "The Earth delegation is welcome to address the council." Sarah had prepared a speech. She had worked on it for 3 months. It was thorough and well-sourced and said everything she had intended to say. She set it aside. She stood at the podium and said, 18 years ago, the median estimate on Conclave Station was that our political structures would fragment in 9 weeks. Some people bet 3. I want to tell you what happened in those 18 years, not because it proves we deserve your recognition, but because I think you should know what it actually looked like from inside. She spoke for an hour and a half. She did not use notes. She talked about Okafor's announcement and the riots in 6 cities and the 4 governments that collapsed and the pharmaceutical crisis and Dr. Park working at her bench at 9 p.m. waiting for results from the 47th trial. She talked about the constitutional crisis and the revised charter and the arguments in the assembly that went until 3 in the morning and ended without resolution and started again the next day. She talked about the deep space grid and the relay mapping and a cartography project that had started as science and become something else over time. She talked about Dr. Achebe's interviews and the man from Bristol and the shepherd's pie. She talked about the 9 weeks. The people who made that bet were not wrong to be uncertain about us, she said. We were uncertain about ourselves. Uncertainty is not a flaw in your models. It was an accurate reading of what we were. What the models could not capture was what uncertainty does to us. We do not respond to uncertainty by resolving it into acceptance. We respond to it by working. Sometimes badly. Sometimes in the wrong direction. But we do not stop working. I do not know if that is a civilizational quality or a design flaw, but it is what we are. She paused. We are still here. We are more connected to each other than we were 18 years ago, not less. Our science is more collaborative, our institutions more mature, and our understanding of our own failures more clear. I cannot promise you we will not create new problems. I can promise you we will work on them. The council chamber was quiet. Then Councillor Eschlek, who had been promoted from coordinator 3 years prior, made a procedural comment in Vorith that the translation software rendered as, "I believe the evidence speaks clearly. I call for the vote." The vote was 6-1. Semelin, who had written the motion and argued for it for 4 hours, abstained. When asked why, she said that the motion spoke for itself and she preferred to let it stand on its own weight. The one dissenting vote came from a councillor named Praith of the Keth Confederation, who had voted for disengagement 18 years ago and who now said, with a formality that Sarah's cultural advisors told her was the Keth equivalent of respect rather than hostility, that he was voting against the motion not because he believed Earth was unready but because he believed the conclave's original decision had been premature and irresponsible and that voting for reintegration would allow his colleagues to feel absolved of something that deserved to sit with them longer. Sarah filed that away. Stage 1 reintegration. The mechanism was in motion. She stepped outside the chamber and called Secretary General Okafor, who was 81 years old and had been out of office for 6 years but who Sarah still called first for things like this. "We're in," she said. There was a long pause. "How long?" Okafor asked, which was not the question Sarah had expected. 6-1. Stage 1. It's the first step, not the last, but it's real. I know. Another pause. I meant how long do we have before they figure out we're going to be more trouble than we're worth? Sarah laughed. It surprised her. She pressed a hand to the wall of the corridor outside the chamber and laughed. A while, she said. I think a while.